At my husband's funeral, my son brought the woman who ruined our family, and he called her his father's real wife. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just watched them hand me an envelope and erase me in front of 100 people. He said I had 24 hours to leave the house. She smiled like she'd finally won. But what they didn't know was that Robert left behind one thing, something neither of them expected, and I plan to use it. Where are you listening from right now? Subscribe if you've ever been erased, then made them regret it. The house didn't welcome me back. It swallowed me whole, like it had been waiting to do so. I walked past the foyer where Simon handed me the envelope. His voice still echoed flat, final. This house is no longer yours. I left my heels by the door. I moved like a ghost through the home I built. I didn't look at the wedding photos, or the sofa where Simon first said mama, or the kitchen drawer with my measuring spoon still inside. Instead, I walked straight to Robert's study, the one room I never had a key to, the one he said, "Don't worry about what's in there, just trust me." I trusted, and I stayed out for 32 years, until today. The funeral home had returned his personal effects, watch, wallet, and one brass key barely longer than a thumbtack. It clicked into the lower drawer with a sound like breaking glass. Inside a leather-bound journal, thick, heavy, smelled like ink and regret. I ran my hand across the cover, felt his imprint in the worn edges, then opened to the first page. It began like a confession. No, dear Dahlia, no apology, just a fact. I don't have much time left. My throat tightened, not out of grief, out of recognition. This was his real voice. Cold, calculated. I met Elena when she was 23. She reminded me of ambition. She reminded me of youth. She made me feel untouchable again. My hands shook, but I kept reading. He described their secret apartment, the money he moved quietly into her lifestyle, vacations Simon never knew were visits to her, bonuses redirected to her accounts. But that wasn't the worst of it. I needed Simon on my side, he wrote. And to do that, I had to make him hate her, me. He forged transactions, fake hotel stays, doctored text messages between me and some invented man. Then he sat our son down and handed him the evidence. He cried, Robert wrote, but he believed me, because why wouldn't he? His father gave him proof. His mother said it's not true, and the world teaches boys to trust proof, not pleas. I felt something snap behind my ribs, but I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I closed the journal slowly, my fingers pressed into the cover until my knuckles paled. The drawer still open, now empty, except for the truth inside my hand. He built his lies inside this house, inside our son, but he left the match that could burn them all down. They wanted to erase me, but I had the last thing he ever wrote. And that was where my silence ended. They came the next morning, not to grieve, not to check on me. They came with a suitcase and a smile. Elena wore ivory slacks and a camel coat like she was arriving at her weekend home in the Hamptons. Simon carried a clipboard, a stack of documents, and zero shame. Mom, he said, let's keep this civil. I didn't move, didn't invite them in, but the door was open, and they stepped in anyway. Elena glanced around like she was house hunting. She paused at the staircase, smoothed the banister with one manicured hand. I always loved this house, she said, even before it was ours. Ours. I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny, it was surgical. Cold and clean like a scalpel slicing through skin without blood. Simon laid the papers on the console table. Dad updated his will 3 years ago, he said. The house the firm shares the estate. They all transfer to me. He said it like a realtor pitching a listing, like he hadn't grown up opening Christmas gifts by that fireplace. I said nothing. He pushed the clipboard toward me. There's a stipend, modest but consistent. It should cover basic needs. I looked down, $2,000 a month. No house, no medical coverage, no ownership. Just enough to rent a corner of someone else's life. I stepped aside. Let them pass into the living room. Elena sat in my reading chair, crossed her legs like she'd done it 100 times. She picked up a framed photo of Simon as a boy, held it, smiled, then set it down face down. "You have 24 hours, Simon said. We've already booked the movers." Elena stood again, walked to the window. "This view," she murmured, "just like Robert described it." She turned to me. "You don't have to make this ugly, Dahlia. No one wants to involve the police." Police. I almost smiled, not because I was amused, but because she had no idea what Robert had done. Not just to me, but to her too. I said I'd like to speak to my son alone. She raised an eyebrow. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of me." Simon didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. "We're done here," he said. "You can start packing your personal things." I stood very still. 32 years, gone in 14 minutes. No apology, no memory acknowledged. Not a single "Are you okay?" "I'll be out by evening," I said, my voice steady as stone. Elena's lips curved. Smart woman. She walked past me again, close enough for her perfume to linger. Simon hesitated at the door. For half a second, his eyes met mine, and there was something there. A flicker, or maybe I imagined it. He looked away, left. The front door closed. I was alone again, but I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. I went upstairs and opened the closet. I chose only what mattered. My mother's pearls, a photo of Simon when he still looked at me with trust, and the journal. Always the journal. They thought I would vanish quietly. But I was packing with precision, not to leave, to begin. The next morning, I drove to the police station in silence. No music, no radio, only the sound of my breath and the journal in my lap. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. "I have evidence," I said, and no more time to wait. Detective Nash Breyer met me in a plain room with metal chairs and peeling paint. He looked tired, but alert. "I've read your husband's name before," he said. "Too many times. Fraud cases, complaints, whispers that never stuck." I placed the journal on the table. "Then you'll want to read this." He opened to the first page, scanned quickly, then slowed. His eyes stopped blinking. I watched every reaction, every furrow in his brow. When he finished 3 pages, he sat back and blew out a breath. "Well, Mrs. Mercer, this changes things." He asked questions. Dates, names, signatures. I answered with precision. Then came the part I hadn't expected. "There's a problem," he said. "Your name appears on several financial documents, linked to offshore accounts." I froze. "That's impossible." He slid a file toward me. "Accounts in the Caymans, over $6 million transferred in the last 3 years. Your signature is on each one." I shook my head slowly. "I never signed those. I never even saw those documents." He opened another folder. "Your passport shows 2 trips to the Caymans, 5 and 3 years ago." My mind reeled. I thought they were vacations, anniversary trips. He handled everything. I stayed by the pool while he took calls. Breyer tapped his pen. "Mrs. Mercer, I've done this for 20 years. Everyone says they didn't know." "I didn't," I said softly, and I meant it. He studied me. I don't know what he saw, but it made him pause. "I'm not placing you under arrest," he said, "yet. But you're now a person of interest. Your passport has been flagged. Don't leave town." I left the station numb. Not afraid, not broken, just clarified. Robert didn't just betray me, he built an escape hatch. And if it collapsed, he made sure I'd be buried with him. In the parking lot, my phone rang. It was Marietta. I heard from someone at the firm. Simon's been called in for questioning. I didn't reply. I watched the clouds slide across the sky, white against cold blue. Let the truth come. Let it bury what it must. I had nothing left to protect except the truth. And that was finally mine. The garden hadn't changed. Roses still climbed the fence. The stone path still cracked in the same place near the gate. And Simon still used the side entrance like a stranger, unsure if he was welcome. I heard the door creak. His footsteps on the tile, then silence. I didn't turn. I kept pruning the roses, kept my breath steady. He cleared his throat. I only came to get a few things, he said. I won't be long. I clipped a dead bloom, dropped it in the bucket, then finally looked at him. He wore a suit, but not the confident one. This one sagged around the shoulders. "How is the police station?" I asked. His mouth tightened. They asked about Dad's accounts, the offshore ones. He hesitated. "They asked about you too." "Of course they did." He walked closer, then stopped near the porch rail. "Why are they finding your name on documents?" "Because he put it there," I said, and I trusted him. "That's not an answer." I set the shears down, faced him fully. "No, Simon. It's the only answer." His eyes darted away. I saw the transfers, the signatures. "And do you still believe everything you see?" He flinched, just barely, but I saw it. "I believed he was protecting us," he said quietly. "I believed you destroyed our family." And now, he didn't speak, didn't move, only stared at the roses like they held answers. "I never cheated on your father," I said. "My worst sin was believing he loved me too much to lie." He swallowed hard. "I don't know what's true anymore." That's a start. A long silence, then. "Elena, she got a call. The board froze Dad's assets." I nodded once. "They're unraveling everything." Simon exhaled. "You said he left a journal. I gave it to the detective." "Why didn't you show me first? Would you have believed it?" He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. I picked up my shears again, snipped another bloom, clean, final. He turned to leave, then stopped. If this all falls apart, what happens to us?" I looked at him not as a traitor, not even as a son, but as a man trying to crawl back from a lie. "That depends," I said, "on who you stand with when the truth arrives." He walked away, shoulders hunched, hands in fists, but slower than before. He didn't slam the gate. And for the first time, he looked back. She came just before sunset. A knock, soft, hesitant, not like Elena's, not like Simon's. I opened the door to find a young woman, barely 30, with a messenger bag and eyes that kept scanning the porch. "Mrs. Mercer," she asked. "I'm Jennifer Lawson. I used to work for your husband." Her voice cracked on "used to." I let her in, quietly. She didn't sit right away, didn't drink the tea I offered. She paced instead like she had rehearsed something and couldn't get it out. "I should have come sooner," she said. "But I was afraid. Robert was intimidating." She finally opened her bag, pulled out a folder, thick. "I started as a junior accountant 2 years ago. 6 months in, I noticed discrepancies, funds moving from client accounts into strange shell companies." She handed me copies, emails, bank reports, internal memos. I didn't know what I was looking at, but one name repeated through the pages like a bad echo: Martin Gregory. "He executed the transfer," she said. "Robert gave the orders, but Martin made it happen." I sat down, my fingers tightening around the paper. "Martin sat next to me at the funeral," I murmured. "He hugged me." Jennifer nodded slowly. "He knew you had no idea. He called you clean collateral." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that was exactly what I had become. Clean and discarded. "Why now?" I asked. "Why bring this to me?" "I took the documents to the police already," she said. "But they're moving slow. Gregory has friends, influence. He's protected." She swallowed. "They said it would help if someone with standing, someone like you, confirmed the pattern." I looked back down. Gregory's name, client losses, numbers that looked like made-up statistics until I found my parents' account listed. "Your husband's fraud hurt a lot of people," Jennifer whispered. "But Gregory, he made it permanent." I stood, walked to the fireplace, lit the folder's edge. then snuffed it out, not to destroy it, to see if it would burn. Because next time, if no one listened, I would burn it all. I turned to her. "Thank you for your courage," I said. "Now go, and don't tell anyone you were here." She nodded and left as quietly as she came. Outside, the sky had turned violet, soft and deceptive. I picked up the phone, called Detective Breyer. "I have something new," I told him. "And it doesn't just touch Robert anymore." He asked for names. I gave them. When I hung up, I stood alone in the foyer. My reflection in the mirror didn't flinch. I wasn't grieving anymore. I wasn't afraid. They thought I was the loose end, but I was the fuse, and someone just handed me a match. The message came at dawn, short, abrupt, no greeting. "I found a key in Dad's desk. Meeting you at the station. Bring everything." I didn't reply, didn't ask for more. I dressed, packed the journal, and walked into the morning like a woman heading to court, not confession. Detective Breyer met me with tired eyes and a folder. Before either of us spoke, Simon walked in. He looked different, less certain, more human. He carried a manila envelope, held it like it was radioactive. "I opened the box," he said. "At First National, the safe deposit." Breyer motioned for him to sit. Simon didn't. He placed the envelope on the table, then stepped back like it might explode. Inside, a USB drive, bank transfer records, and a handwritten letter. I recognized the scrawl instantly. Robert's. The detective inserted the USB. The screen blinked. Then, Robert's face. Sickly, thin, but still carrying that smug calm like he always had a plan. "If this is being watched," he began, "then I'm dead." Simon flinched. I didn't. "I lied," Robert continued. "To my partners, to my wife, to my son." He coughed, paused, then looked straight into the lens. "Elena was never the plan. She was the disguise. Martin Gregory was the real partner." My stomach twisted. "I fabricated evidence against Dahlia," he said flatly. "Photos, bank statements, all false. I needed Simon to turn against her." Simon's knees gave. He sat without speaking. "She didn't steal anything," Robert said. "She didn't cheat. She only trusted me too long." Breyer paused the video, looked between us. "Do you understand what this is?" Simon nodded, barely. "She gave me that journal," Breyer said. "But this closes the loop." I reached for the letter, opened it. My name at the top, Dahlia. "If you're reading this, it means the lies ended. And I dragged you through hell before I let go. You never deserved it, but I couldn't stop myself." I folded it quietly, didn't say a word. Simon stood. His voice was broken glass. "He made me hate you. I know. And I believed it. All of it. I know." He looked at me then, not through me. "What do I do now?" I touched the envelope, the USB, the pages filled with fire. "Start by standing on the right side," I said, "and never leave it again." He nodded, then looked at Breyer. "Make it public, everything. I don't care who gets destroyed." Breyer clicked his pen. It already started. That evening, Gregory's name hit the news. And my silence finally shattered. The news broke the next morning. Martin Gregory arrested at a private airstrip, passport in hand, heading for a country with no extradition treaty. The headline read, "Financial giant falls Mercer partner indicted for $70 million fraud." They called it a bombshell. I called it overdue. The house phone rang 3 times. I didn't answer. On the 4th ring, Detective Breyer left a message. "We've frozen all remaining assets. Elena Cross has confessed to perjury and obstruction. She's cooperating to reduce her sentence." I poured coffee, sat in my kitchen, listened to the wind nudge the windows. Breyer's voice crackled on the machine. One more thing. The property deed Robert never finalized the transfer to Simon." I froze. "That meant the house is still legally yours," he said, "and it's staying that way." I didn't smile, didn't jump up. I just placed the coffee cup down, clean, centered, like it belonged again. Later that day, Simon returned. No clipboard, no cold eyes, just a folded document in his hands. I found this too, he said. Dad called it the redemption fund. $2 million. Clean. In my name. No strings. It was meant for you, Simon added. In case things fell apart. I raised an eyebrow. Fell apart. He wrote, if she survives me, she'll need something untouched by my lies. I took the document, held it, then set it aside. Why are you really here? I asked. Simon sat across from me, for once not like a lawyer, not like a stranger, just my son. I can't undo what I said, what I believed, but I want to understand. I want to come back from this. I stirred my coffee, watched the cream bloom. I never stopped being your mother, I said. You just stopped being my son for a while. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. He just nodded, once, like a man who knew the cost. That night I walked through the house. Room by room, removed what didn't belong. Elena's scarf in my bedroom. Gone. Her lipstick-stained mug in my cabinet. Gone. No rage, just reclamation. As I stood on the porch, wind brushing my face, Simon stepped beside me. I've already spoken to the prosecutors, he said. I'm giving up my claim on the estate. I looked at him, not surprised, not triumphant. Just level, not because I deserve anything, he added, but because I don't. He turned to go, then paused. Do you want me to stay? I didn't answer right away, because forgiveness doesn't come fast. It comes honest. Not tonight, I said, but maybe next week. And that was the first piece I'd spoken in years. He came back on a Sunday. No warning, no suit, just jeans-worn boots and a small tree in his arms. A sapling, apple, its roots still wrapped in burlap. I watched him through the window. He stood at the gate, unsure if he should knock. I opened the door before he raised his hand. Is that what I think it is? I asked. He glanced down. Thought you might want something new, to grow. I didn't move aside, not yet. I'm not ready for apologies, I said. Good, he replied. I didn't bring one, I brought this. He held out the tree like an offering. I stepped back just enough. He came in slowly, mud tracing behind his boots. We walked to the backyard, same path he used to race across at 5 superhero cape flying. The soil near the rose garden was soft, still damp from last week's rain. He knelt without speaking, started digging. I brought out a spade, joined him, side by side, 2 people who knew better than to force words. After 10 minutes, the hole was ready. We lowered the sapling, patted soil around its roots, pressed gently with our palms, then stood back. It looked small, fragile, but real. Do you think it'll grow? He asked. I didn't answer right away. I touched one of the leaves, bright green, uncreased. If we care for it, I said, if we stay. He nodded. Not a promise, but maybe the start of one. We didn't hug, didn't cry, didn't pretend things were easy. But we stood there under morning light with dirt on our hands and something new in the ground. I rented a place nearby, he said. Nothing fancy. I nodded. That's good. I'll come check on the tree, if that's okay. It's not mine, I said. It's ours if we earn it. He looked up at me, eyes tired but clearer. You used to say that about love, he murmured. I still do. He didn't reply, just touched the tree's trunk gentle like he didn't trust his own strength. Then he left. No promises, no declarations. Just the silence of real things taking root. That night I stood at the kitchen window watching the tree sway under stars. Not strong yet, but it didn't need to be. Not today. It was planted. That was enough. She showed up with a letter in hand and eyes that looked too tired for her age. Not a reporter, not a neighbor. She introduced herself simply Claire Montrose. I used to work with your husband. I remembered her name, payroll manager, left the firm a decade ago. I remembered Robert saying she wasn't team material. Claire sat on the edge of the armchair like it still belonged to someone else. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. "It's from him," she said. "Came in the mail 2 days ago, no return address." She passed it to me. No envelope, just a folded page. Same handwriting, same slant. Same control. "Claire, I know what I did to you. I lied when I said I'd leave her. I lied when I said you'd get your shares back. You deserve better. But I needed your silence. You cost less than the truth." I read it twice. The words weren't sharp, they were familiar. Not because they hurt, but because they matched the script he once wrote for me. Claire looked down. He said he loved me. He said he just needed time. Then one day I came into work and my desk was gone. No warning, just security. My jaw didn't move. My chest didn't rise. I simply folded the letter again and handed it back. "He did it to all of us," I said. Claire nodded, but I thought I was the only one. So had I. And that was the trick. Isolation, private promises, lies personalized. He told me Claire added that his wife didn't understand him. I almost smiled, a bitter kind of kinship. She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. I kept everything she said, emails, wire requests, internal notes he made me sign. I didn't flinch. I simply placed it beside the others in a box marked not with names, but reasons to keep going. Claire stood slowly. "I don't want money. I don't want revenge." "What do you want?" I asked. She exhaled, just to stop thinking it was my fault. It wasn't. I said it clearly, louder than I'd meant to. She blinked, then nodded. Outside, the sky had gone gray again, muted, like it knew. As she left, I caught my reflection in the glass, and I looked lighter. Not because justice had come, but because the lie that I was alone had broken. He didn't destroy me because I was weak. He tried because I was never meant to stay quiet. And now, I wasn't. The wind had shifted. Not the kind that rustles leaves, the kind that carries change. Simon knocked just after lunch. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his steps felt steadier. I keep thinking about something Dad said he told me. In the video, right before he signed off, he paused. He said, "If it all falls apart, the insurance is still where I left it." I blinked. Insurance. Yeah, but it wasn't in the deposit box. We stood in silence for a moment, then our eyes met, and we both turned toward the back porch. The garden shed. He hadn't touched it in years, but no one had. Simon led the way. I followed slowly, each step heavier than the last. Inside, dust rust and rotting wood, tools untouched, a lawn chair still folded. But one wall had always looked wrong, too flat, too smooth. Simon knocked once, then again, hollow. I handed him the crowbar. 3 pulls, 2 groans from old nails, and a panel gave way. Behind it, a waterproof lockbox. Cold, heavy, gray. He set it on the bench. I opened it. Inside, a second USB. Original contract signed by Gregory. A printout of internal transfer logs. And a short handwritten note. "If Martin tries to run, this will pin him down. Even his money can't clean this." Simon stared at the signature on the contracts, then looked at me. "These are real, not copies, not doctored." He pulled out his phone, called Detective Breyer on speaker. "I think we found the insurance," he said. "And I think it's time to drop the hammer." Breyer arrived within the hour. Gloves, evidence bags, a flash drive reader already in his pocket. He scanned the files in silence, then nodded. "These logs show Gregory authorized 10 final transfers after Robert's diagnosis, right before everything imploded." "Game over?" Simon asked. "Not just over," Breyer replied. "This takes it federal." He packed everything carefully, asked if we wanted to file a formal declaration. I said yes. Simon did too. We signed together. Later, as the sun fell behind the trees, we stood by the now empty wall. Dust still hung in the air. Funny, Simon said. I spent years thinking Dad kept his secrets in his study. But the truth was here, with the spiders. I didn't laugh, but I placed my hand on his shoulder. He hid it somewhere no one would look, I said, not even himself. That night, I marked the wall with red chalk, not for memory, but for closure. The house had spoken. Now it was our turn. 3 weeks later, the trial began. Gregory pled not guilty. Of course he did. But the evidence didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't lie. The USBs, the contracts, the voice of a dying man who finally told the truth, they spoke louder than any defense. Elena accepted a plea deal, 5 years, 2 served with cooperation. Simon testified. So did I. We didn't look at her. The courtroom didn't feel like victory. It felt like disinfectant, necessary, but sterile. After the hearing, I walked past reporters, past stares, back into a world that looked the same, but no longer felt borrowed. The house was still mine, and for the first time, it felt earned. I stood in the garden that evening beside the apple tree. Its leaves had grown fuller, the roots deeper. Simon joined me quietly. He didn't ask to come. He didn't need to. He carried a small plaque, wooden, unpolished. He placed it by the base of the tree, planted in truth, tended in repair, for her. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. Inside the living room was brighter, lighter. Marietta and I had repainted the walls, removed the heavy curtains Robert liked, let the light in. I kept a single photo of him, tucked in a drawer, not to honor him, but to remember what silence cost. I donated half the redemption fund to a nonprofit that helped women recover from financial manipulation. The other half, I used it to renovate a wing at the public library, a reading room named after my mother. She used to say, "When they try to erase you, write louder," and I had. One morning, Simon brought coffee and didn't flinch when I handed him the stronger mug. "Still bitter?" he asked. I sipped, smirked, only in flavor. He chuckled, sat with me on the porch. "I'm proud of you," I said. He didn't look away. "I'm trying to be proud of me too." And that was enough. The final envelope Robert ever left me never opened again. Because I didn't need his last word. I had my own. And it sounded like this, clear, cold, and alive. "My name is Dahlia Mercer. They tried to erase me. But I redrew the line, and this time it's permanent. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me. Through betrayal, through silence, through the kind of justice that doesn't scream, but stands. Have you ever felt erased and had to fight just to exist again? Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what you would have done if they called someone else your name and handed them your life. And if this story found you at the right time, stay, subscribe. There are more voices like mine, waiting to be heard.